This is English 201, Week 3, Part 8. By the way, there is a comic book. I think there's more than one comic book version of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Those are quite good. Um, I remember liking one of them. I don't remember which one. But if you're interested in that, you could try tracking those down. I think they're pretty good. Yeah. There's also a movie called Kafka. I wouldn't watch that. It's real confusing. It would confuse you a lot. And it's also like not that good a movie. And actually, now that I think about it, I feel like it's hard to find. So don't worry about it. Okay, cool. Let's keep going. Bottom of page 1. Last paragraph on page 1. He was still hurriedly thinking all this through, unable to decide to get out of bed, when the clock struck 7:15. There was a cautious knock at the door near his head. "Gregor," somebody called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go somewhere?" That gentle voice. Gregor was shocked when he heard his own voice answering. It could hardly be recognized as the voice he had had before. As if from deep inside him there was a painful and uncontrollable squeaking mixed in with it. The words could be made out at first, but then there was a sort of echo which made them unclear, leaving the hearer unsure whether he had heard properly or not. Gregor had wanted to give a full answer and explain everything, but in the circumstances contented himself with saying, "Yes, mother, thank you, I'm getting up now." The change in Gregor's voice probably could not be noticed outside through the wooden door, as his mother was satisfied with this explanation and shuffled away, but this short conversation made the other members of the family aware that Gregor, against their expectations, was still at home, and soon his father came knocking at one of the side doors, gently, but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called, "what's wrong?" And after a short while he called again, with a warning deepness in his voice. "Gregor, Gregor!" At the other side door, his sister came plaintively. "Gregor, aren't you well? Do you need anything?" Gregor answered to both sides. "I'm ready now," making an effort to remove all strangeness from his voice by enunciating very clearly and putting long pauses between each individual word. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg of you." Gregor, however, had no thought of opening the door, and instead congratulated himself for his cautious habit, acquired from his traveling, of locking all doors at night, even when he was at home. The first thing he wanted to do was get up in peace without being disturbed, to get dressed, and most of all, to have his breakfast. Only then would he consider what to do next, as he was well aware that he would not bring his thoughts to any sensible conclusions by lying in bed. He remembered that he had often felt a slight pain in bed, perhaps caused by lying awkwardly, but that had always turned out to be pure imagination, and he wondered how his imaginings would slowly resolve themselves today. He did not have the slightest doubt that the change in his voice was nothing more than the first sign of a serious cold, which was an occupational hazard for traveling salesmen. It was a simple matter to throw off the covers. He only had to blow himself up a little, and they fell by themselves. But it became difficult after that, especially as he was so exceptionally broad. He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up, but instead of them, he only had these little legs continuously moving in different directions, which he was moreover unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then the first one would stretch itself out, and if he managed finally to do what he wanted with that leg, all the others seemed to be set free and would move about painfully. "This is something that can't be done in bed," Gregor said to himself, "so don't keep trying to do it." The first thing he wanted to do was get the lower part of his body out of the bed, but he had never seen his lower part and could not imagine what it looked like. It turned out to be too hard to move. It went so slowly, and finally, almost in a frenzy, he carelessly shoved himself forwards with all the force he could gather. He chose the wrong direction. He hit hard against the lower bedpost and learned from the burning pain he felt that the lower part of his body might well, at present, be the most sensitive. So then he tried to get the top part of his body out of the bed first, carefully turning his head to the side. He managed quite easily, and despite its breadth and height, the bulk of his body eventually followed slowly into the direction of the head. But when he had last got his head out of the bed and into the fresh air, it occurred to him that if he let himself fall, it would be a miracle if his head were not injured, so he became afraid to carry on pushing himself forward the same way. And he could not knock himself out now at any price. Better to stay in bed than lose consciousness. It took just as much effort to get back to where he had been earlier, but when he lay there sighing and was once more thinking of watching his legs as they struggled against each other even harder than before, that it was possible, if that was possible, he could think of no way of bringing peace and order to this chaos. He told himself once more that it was not possible for him to stay in bed, and the most sensible thing to do would be to get free of it in whatever way he could, at whatever sacrifice. At the same time, though, he did not forget to remind himself that calm consideration was much better than rushing to desperate conclusions. At times like this, he would direct his eyes to the window and look out as clearly as he could. But unfortunately, even the other side of the narrow street was enveloped in a morning fog, and the view had very little confidence to cheer him. Sorry, and the view had little confidence or cheer to offer him. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the clock struck again. 7 o'clock, and there's still fog like this. He lay there quietly a while longer, breathing lightly, as if he perhaps expected the total stillness to bring things back to their real and natural state. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I'll definitely have got properly out of bed. And by then, somebody will have come round from work to ask what happened to me as well, as they open up work before 7 o'clock. And so he set himself the task of swinging the entire length of his body out of the bed all at the same time. If he succeeded in falling out of bed in this way and kept his head raised as he did, he would probably avoid injuring it. His back seemed to be quite hard, and probably nothing would happen to it falling onto the carpet. His main concern was for the loud noise he was bound to make, and which even through all the doors would probably raise concern, if not alarm. But it was something that had to be risked. When Gregor was already sticking halfway out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort, and all he had to do was rock back and forth. It occurred to him how simple everything would be if somebody came to help him. Two strong people, he had his father and the maid in mind, would have been more than enough. They would only have to push their arms under the dome of his back, peel him away from the bed, bend down the load, and then be patient and careful as he swang over onto the floor, where hopefully his little legs would find use. Should he really call for help, though, even apart from the fact that all the doors were locked? Despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. After a while, he had already moved so far across that it would have been hard for him to keep his balance if he rocked too hard. The time was now 7:10, and he would have liked to make a final and he would have to make a final decision very soon. There was a ring at the door of the flat. That'll be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze very still, although his little legs only came all the more lively as they danced around. For a moment, everything remained quiet. They're not opening the door, Gregor said to himself, caught in some nonsensical hope. But then, of course, the maid's firm footsteps went to the door and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words of greeting, and he knew who it was, the chief clerk himself. Why did Gregor have to be the only one condemned to work for a company where they immediately became highly suspicious at the slightest shortcoming? Were all employees, every one of them, louts? And was there not one of them who was faithful and devoted, who would go so mad with pangs of conscience that he couldn't get out of bed if he didn't spend at least a couple of hours in the morning on company business? Was it really not enough to let one of the trainees make inquiries? Assuming inquiries were even necessary, did the chief clerk have to come himself? And did they have to show the whole innocent family that this was so suspicious that only the chief clerk could be trusted to have the proper wisdom to investigate it? And more because these thoughts had made him upset than through any proper decision, he swung himself with all his force out of the bed. There was a loud thump, but it wasn't really a loud noise. His fall was softened a little by the carpet, and Gregor's back was also more elastic than he had thought, which made the sound muffled and not too noticeable. He had not held his head carefully enough, though, and it hit as he fell. Annoyed and in pain, he turned it and rubbed it against the carpet. Something's fallen down there, said the chief clerk in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something of the sort that had happened to him today could ever happen to the chief clerk, too. He had to concede it was possible. But as if in gruff reply to this question, the chief clerk's firm footsteps and his highly polished boots could now be heard in the adjoining room. From the room on his right, Gregor's sister whispered to him to let him know, Gregor, the chief clerk is here. Yes, I know, said Gregor to himself, but without daring to raise his voice loud enough for his sister to hear him. Gregor, said his father, now from the room on the left, the chief clerk has come round and wants to know why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him. And anyway, he wants to speak to you personally, so please open the door. I'm sure he'll be good enough to forgive the untidiness of your room. Then the chief clerk called, Good morning, Mr. Samsa. He isn't well, his mother told the chief clerk, while his father continued to speak through the door. He isn't well, please believe me. Why else would Gregor have missed a train? The lad only ever thinks about business. It makes me cross, angry. The way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been in town for a week now, but he stayed home every evening. He sits with us in the kitchen and just reads the paper or studies train timetables. His idea of relaxation is working with his fret saw. It's like a little tool that he had the frame out of. He's made this little frame, for instance. It only took him 2 or 3 evenings. You'd be amazed how nice it is. It's hanging in his room. You'll see it as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. We wouldn't have been able to get Gregor to open the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn, and I'm sure he isn't. Well, he said this morning that he isn't. He said this morning that he is, but he isn't. I'll be there in a moment, Gregor said, slowly and thoughtfully, but without moving so that he would not miss any word of the conversation. Well, I can't think of any other way of explaining it, Mr. Samsa, said the chief clerk. I hope it's nothing serious. But on the other hand, I must say that if we people in commerce ever become slightly unwell, then fortunately or unfortunately as you like, we simply have to overcome it because of business considerations. Can the chief clerk come in and see you now? Asked his father impatiently, knocking on the door again. No, said Gregor. In the room on the right, there followed painful silence. In the room on his left, his sister began to cry. See you in the next video.